You're mourning the loss of your child, trying to say goodbye to your son at his funeral, and suddenly, the cops show up. Why? Because a neighbor, the so-called Karen of the neighborhood, decided to call them on your daughter. But here's the twist. She had no idea who I was. She didn't know I'm the Attorney General. This is a story that starts in the darkest moments of my life, a time when I was already grappling with the unbearable grief of losing my son. It was supposed to be a day of remembrance, a day when my family could come together to say goodbye and find some peace. But, as fate would have it, the last thing I expected was for the police to show up at my son's funeral. And to top it off, it wasn't even for something legitimate. It was because of a petty neighborhood dispute that had no place at such a delicate time. But the worst part? The person who called the cops didn't even know who I was. I'm the Attorney General of this state, and I've seen a lot of my years of service, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that day. It wasn't just a simple complaint. It was an attempt to ruin a moment that no one should have to experience. All because of a neighbor who, like many in our community, had a very misguided sense of authority. Now, you might be wondering, how did this all even start? What could possibly lead someone to call the cops at a funeral, especially for something as trivial as a neighborhood dispute? Well, the person who caused all this trouble was none other than Carol Mitchell, a woman who made it her mission to meddle in everyone's business. The type of person who believes that her word is law and that her version of rules should govern the neighborhood. Carol was the kind of neighbor who always had something to say about how people should live their lives, even if it was none of her business. She was known around the block as the Neighborhood Watch, even though she wasn't really a part of any formal group. She made it a point to stick her nose into every issue, from yard care to who was parking where. Her sense of superiority and obsession with control were downright exhausting for everyone who lived nearby. But never in my wildest dreams did I think Carol would take it so far, especially at a time when my family needed nothing more than some space to grieve. It was a moment I thought was private, sacred even, but for Carol, no moment was beyond her reach. She had her eyes on the smallest of details, and the smallest of grievances became her battlefield. So, when my daughter and I were handling the arrangements and trying to find some peace after my son's passing, Carol decided it was the perfect time to strike. Little did she know, she was about to pick a fight with the wrong person. It was a chilly November morning when we gathered to say goodbye to my son. The sky was heavy with clouds, casting a dull light over the cemetery, the kind of weather that matches the heaviness in your heart when you're mourning the loss of a loved one. We had only a small group of close family and friends, keeping the ceremony intimate, as my son had always wanted. His passing was unexpected, and we were still grappling with the rawness of it all. My daughter, who had always been the strong one, was struggling the most. We both were. The funeral itself was everything you'd expect, a painful reminder of how fragile life is. There were tears, shared memories, and even laughter at some of the funny things my son had said during his life. We didn't want to let go of him, but we knew we had to. It was supposed to be a day for grieving and healing. We were trying to find solace in each other's presence. We didn't need anyone else complicating things. But Carol Mitchell, our next-door neighbor, had other plans. Carol was the type of woman who never knew when to mind her own business. The type who liked to keep track of every little thing going on in the neighborhood, whether it was the state of your lawn, the color of your house, or the way you park your car. She wasn't just concerned with her own life. She wanted to make sure everyone else was living according to her rules. And it wasn't just small stuff, either. No, Carol had a habit of taking everything to the extreme. If she had a problem with something, she made it her personal mission to make sure everyone knew about it. Her meddling was an ongoing issue for several people in the neighborhood, but no one had ever dared to take a stand against her. We had always had a bit of tension with Carol. She was the self-appointed neighborhood enforcer, constantly scrutinizing and complaining about the smallest things. At first, I tried to avoid her whenever possible. I was busy with work, and there was no point in engaging with her, especially since I knew how difficult she could be. But I never imagined that someone so petty could target us in a time like this. After all, it was a funeral. What kind of person would disrupt a funeral over something trivial? But Carol, as I was about to learn, was not just your typical busybody. She was relentless, and the boundaries of human decency seemed non-existent for her. I had known Carol for years, but I had no idea how far she would go in her quest to control the neighborhood. In hindsight, I probably should have expected it. People like Carol always find a way to insert themselves into matters they know nothing about. And, in her eyes, I had become a target. The problem started a few weeks before the funeral. My family had decided to have the memorial service at our house. The weather was finally cooling down, and the large backyard overlooking the river was the perfect place to gather. The house had been in the family for years, and we had always taken pride in keeping it in good shape. My son had always loved the view from the porch, and it was only fitting that we honor him there. We had planned everything carefully, making sure that the service was a quiet and respectful occasion. Nothing extravagant, just family, friends, and memories of a boy who had touched all our hearts. That was when Carol first started to cause trouble. It wasn't the kind of trouble you would expect from someone with such a loud, obvious demeanor. No, Carol was more subtle than that. It started with small complaints, the kind that seemed almost trivial at first. She would mention how the flowers in the backyard weren't aligned properly, or how the seating arrangement was slightly off from the perfect configuration she believed we should have followed. These were just tiny issues that didn't matter to anyone but Carol. But it wasn't about the flowers or the seats. It was about control. As the days leading up to the funeral passed, I found myself getting more and more irritated by Carol's interference. It was as if she was determined to put her mark on everything. One morning, she even came over to my house with a small stack of papers in her hands. When I asked what it was, she informed me that she had been talking to some people in the neighborhood about our event. She said there had been some complaints about the way we were handling the memorial. She was trying to be subtle, but it was clear as day what she was doing. She was creating drama where there was none, and stirring up trouble just to keep herself busy. Her concerned visits turned into full-on critiques of everything from the parking arrangements to the supposed noise the event might cause. And none of it was based in reality. Our family had always kept to ourselves, respectful of the neighborhood's peace and quiet. But Carol wasn't satisfied with that. It wasn't until the day of the funeral, when my daughter and I were already overwhelmed with grief and trying to get everything set up, that the situation escalated. As we were greeting guests and preparing the last details, I noticed a police car pull up to the driveway. At first, I thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they were looking for someone else. But then I saw Carol standing off to the side, her arms crossed in that familiar, judgmental stance. She was watching the scene unfold, as if waiting for something to go wrong. I felt a lump in my throat, and an uneasy sensation spread over me. How could this be happening right now? At my son's funeral? But Carol was determined to make this moment her own. And now, she had involved the police. The officer who approached us looked genuinely confused as he asked what was going on. I couldn't believe it. Why was the police even here? What possible reason could there be for them to show up at a funeral? But Carol had given him a story about a noise complaint, about a disruption to the neighborhood's peace. All because she didn't like the idea of small gathering. It was clear that she wasn't just trying to stop the event. She was trying to make it impossible for us to grieve in peace. The officer seemed sympathetic, but it was obvious that he was just doing his job. He asked to speak with the event coordinator and started to check things over. I was furious, but I tried to stay calm. This wasn't the time or place for confrontation. My daughter, already overwhelmed, was visibly shaken by the entire situation. I tried to explain to the officer that this was a private event and that it was happening at my own house. But Carol wasn't finished. She'd gone even further, exaggerating the situation and making false claims about parking, noise, and even the safety of the event. I had to step in and put an end to it, but Carol wasn't backing down. And that was when I realized that this wasn't just about a neighborhood dispute. It was about power and about someone who would stop at nothing to control everything around her. What Carol didn't know was that I wasn't just some regular homeowner. I wasn't someone she could push around or bully into submission. I was the Attorney General, and I had spent my entire career fighting for justice and the rights of those who had been wronged. And at that moment, I realized that it was time to take a stand, not just for my family, but for everyone who had ever been pushed around by people like Carol. As the police car left, I stood there, seething with anger. But I also knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Carol had no idea what she had just unleashed. It was one of those moments when time seemed to stand still. The weight of everything that had happened, all of Carol's interference, the police arriving at a time when we were meant to mourn, hit me like a truck. There we were, at my son's funeral, and Carol had made it her mission to ruin it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about a small misunderstanding. It was something far deeper. This was about power. Carol was a bully. She tried to exert control over every little detail, from how the flowers were arranged in my backyard to the way my family chose to mourn. She had no respect for our privacy, our grief, or the fact that this was a time to remember someone we loved deeply. I watched my daughter stand off to the side, struggling to hold herself together, while Carol just stood there, watching us with that self-righteous expression on her face. And it hit me, this wasn't just about this one event. Carol had been overstepping her boundaries for years. Her incessant need to control, to meddle in every aspect of everyone else's lives, had turned into something toxic. But today, she had crossed the line. I'd had enough. But I couldn't just storm over there and confront her, not in the middle of a funeral, not when emotions were running high. But the moment the officer had left, I knew I couldn't let this go. Not just for my own peace of mind, but for everyone else who'd suffered under her thumb. And that's when it hit me. Carol had no idea who she was dealing with. As I stood there, watching her retreat to her house, I realized that I was not some average homeowner who could be manipulated by her. I was the Attorney General. I had spent my career fighting for justice, defending the rights of people who were wronged by others who thought they could get away with anything. And now, I was facing someone who thought she could control everything, including my right to grieve in peace. I turned to my daughter, who was still trying to pull herself together. She looked up at me with red eyes, her face a mix of anger and exhaustion. She knew the pain I was feeling, and she knew that this was more than just a small neighborhood dispute. I could see it in her eyes that she, too, was tired of being pushed around. "Dad," she said, her voice quiet, "what are we going to do?" I took a deep breath and looked out at the gathering of mourners still lingering around the yard, the smell of the flowers mixing with the sadness in the air. The peacefulness of the moment had been shattered by Carol's interference, but I was determined not to let her win. This was about more than just Carol. It was about showing her, and anyone else who thought they could get away with bullying, that there were consequences for their actions. I put my arm around my daughter, trying to comfort her as I formulated a plan. "We're going to do what we should have done a long time ago," I said. "We're going to stop letting people like Carol walk all over us. And we're going to do it the right way." I excused myself from the funeral briefly and went inside the house, locking the door behind me. I needed to think clearly. No more distractions, no more interruptions. I grabbed my phone and started making calls. First, I contacted my closest colleague in the Attorney General's office, a trusted ally who had always helped me navigate tricky situations. I explained what had happened, and he immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice calm, yet serious. "She called the police on you during a funeral? For what? A noise complaint? She's gone too far." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Exactly. And I know this is bigger than just this one incident. It's not just about the funeral. It's about her trying to control every aspect of everyone's life in this neighborhood. We need to stop her." My colleague agreed to help me draft a formal letter to the local police, clarifying the situation and requesting that they review the absurdity of her claims. We would also be looking into the fact that Carol had a history of overstepping her bounds in the neighborhood, filing false complaints, and generally being a nuisance. I wanted to make sure that not only would Carol understand that she could no longer get away with these actions, but also that other people in the neighborhood would start seeing her for who she really was, a bully, and someone who needed to be held accountable for her actions. After speaking with my colleague, I knew the next step was to take this public. I needed to get Carol's attention in a way that would make her realize that this behavior would no longer be tolerated. So, I called the local news stations. I wasn't looking to create some media circus, but I needed to put Carol in the spotlight. People like her hide behind their power, because they think they're untouchable. It was time to shine a light on her actions and make sure everyone saw who she really was. The news stations jumped at the story. Not only had she disrupted a funeral, but there was also a larger issue of her bullying behavior in the neighborhood. They agreed to cover the story and wanted to interview me as soon as possible. I knew the moment I went public, Carol would be furious. But at that point, I didn't care. I wasn't doing this for the attention. I was doing it to ensure that no one else would have to go through what my family had been forced to endure that day. The next few days were a whirlwind. The media coverage was everywhere. Reporters came to the house, asking for interviews. Neighbors who had been too intimidated to speak out against Carol started reaching out to share their stories. Everyone had a story about how Carol had made their lives miserable, whether it was over trivial neighborhood rules or making false claims about their properties. It seemed that Carol had made it her personal mission to control everyone around her, and now the community was fed up. By the end of the week, the pressure was mounting on Carol. People were starting to see her for what she was, a bully who had crossed the line. The public outcry was strong, and it was clear that the tide was turning. As the story spread, I could see the wheels of change starting to turn in the neighborhood. People who had been afraid to speak up for fear of retaliation were now standing together. Carol's behavior was no longer just a nuisance. It was now a community issue. And in the end, I realized that by standing up for my family, I had started a chain of events that would have a far-reaching impact. It wasn't just about Carol anymore. It was about sending a message that no one, not even the so-called queen of the neighborhood, could bully or intimidate others without consequences. It was time for people to stop being afraid of people like Carol and take a stand for what's right. And it was clear that Carol's reign of terror in the neighborhood was coming to an end. The turning point had arrived. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when the storm finally hit. It wasn't a natural storm, of course. The air was clear, the sun still shining brightly, and the usual sounds of the neighborhood. Children laughing, birds chirping, filled the spaces between the houses. But it wasn't peace. It was the calm before the storm. That day, everything was coming to a head. The media storm I'd unleashed had already started to hit its peak. Local news outlets, newspapers, and even some national platforms had picked up the story. The town was buzzing. People were finally speaking up, some with relief and others with frustration, but all of them knew one thing. Carol's days of being the uncontested queen of this neighborhood were over. I had made it clear that I was not going to let this stand. My own daughter's grief had been manipulated for Carol's petty power struggle, and now it wasn't just about my family anymore. It had turned into something bigger, a community effort to show that enough was enough. The phone calls, the interviews, and the rallies around Carol's relentless behavior hadn't left her in the least bit shaken. In fact, the opposite had happened. Carol doubled down. She was that kind of person, someone who wouldn't back down when she was cornered, someone who'd rather burn everything down than admit defeat. She was used to wielding her power behind the scenes, unseen, untouchable. Now that the veil had been pulled back, the real Carol was exposed, and she was fighting mad. Carol wasn't just angry at me. She wasn't just angry about the media spotlight or the neighbors turning against her. She was furious that I had dared to expose her power for what it really was. She saw it as a personal attack, a challenge to her control over the community that she'd manipulated for so long. And Carol wasn't one to take that lightly. It was clear that if I didn't act quickly, Carol would find a way to twist this into a narrative that played into her victimhood. She had already started to do just that. There were rumors circulating that I was the one attacking the neighborhood's peaceful environment, that I had used my influence to turn the community against her. The lies she told weren't just about me. They were about the entire neighborhood. Carol was trying to rewrite the story, and she had the perfect stage for it. The people who had been too scared to speak up for so long were now looking to Carol for leadership. The clock was ticking, and I knew I had to get ahead of it. I had to expose her not just for what she had done to my family, but for what she had been doing to everyone around her. I had to finish what I had started, make sure there were no loose ends, no opportunities for Carol to slip away. And that's when I decided to take it to the next level. It was one thing to confront her in the media. It was another to confront her legally. And that's exactly what I did. I called in every favor I could from my network in the legal world. My colleagues in law enforcement, the press, and even some influential figures in town all came together to prepare a case against her. Carol's actions, both at my daughter's funeral and in the years leading up to it, had crossed a line. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was an abuse of power. I knew Carol's time of reigning supreme was over. The rallying cry of the community had reached its tipping point, and it was my job to make sure she couldn't escape the consequences. The local police were ready to take action, and the district attorney's office had already started preparing charges based on the mounting evidence. But Carol wasn't going down without a fight. It started with her trying to convince the other neighbors that this was all an overblown misunderstanding. She held a secret meeting, one that was supposed to rally the supporters she thought she still had, a last-ditch effort to regain control. The room was full of her usual sycophants, those who feared her or relied on her for something. She was attempting to do damage control, trying to convince them that I was just some angry homeowner trying to ruin everything. The problem for her was that the evidence wasn't on her side anymore. The more Carol tried to downplay her role, the more she dug herself into a hole. She tried contacting her allies in the local government, tried to use her influence as a former HOA president to get the police to back off. But it was no use. The community had rallied behind me, and the momentum had shifted in our favor. People were no longer scared to stand up to her. Then came the turning point, the one moment that showed me exactly how far Carol was willing to go to preserve her self-made empire. She made a phone call to the local law enforcement, trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage. She claimed that I was the one causing unrest in the neighborhood, painting me as the villain in a twisted narrative of her own making. That phone call didn't have the effect she hoped for. Instead, it was a massive mistake. The same law enforcement officers who had responded to the situation at my daughter's funeral now recognized the pattern of manipulation. They saw it clearly, the harassment, the interference, and the attempts to control others. And this time, the response was different. The police showed up at Carol's house, and they weren't there to cater to her anymore. They were there to question her. They had already seen enough evidence to know who the real troublemaker was. It was the beginning of the end for her. When the officers arrived, Carol tried to maintain her composure, but the cracks in her facade were beginning to show. She was no longer the untouchable queen of the neighborhood. She was just another person trying to avoid the consequences of her actions. It wasn't just the police that were now confronting her. It was the people she had tried so hard to control. Her supporters were starting to fall away, one by one. I could see it in the way people turned away from her as she tried to salvage her reputation. There was no longer any fear, no longer any uncertainty. And that's when I knew Carol had lost. Her power, once built on manipulation and intimidation, was slipping away. It wasn't going to be an overnight victory, but the writing was on the wall. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I wasn't just some homeowner trying to get her to leave my family alone. I was someone who had the means and the drive to see this through to the end. It wasn't about winning. It was about taking back control from someone who thought she could make everyone around her miserable. Carol had made a serious miscalculation in thinking that she could bully me, my family, or the entire neighborhood into submission. This wasn't just about standing up for myself. It was about standing up for all the people she had trampled over the years. And, in the end, it was about showing Carol that even her worst tactics couldn't silence the truth. As I watched the final pieces fall into place, I could see it clearly. This was going to be a victory for everyone who had been afraid of Carol. A victory for every person who had been too afraid to stand up for themselves, too afraid to confront the woman who had made their lives miserable for far too long. Carol wasn't just losing a battle, she was losing everything. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. In the aftermath of Carol's fall from power, the entire community began to breathe a sigh of relief. The neighborhood that had once been filled with whispered fears and awkward silences was now an open space for conversations, laughter, and connection again. It was like a dark cloud had lifted and the sun was finally shining through. People began to come forward with their stories, sharing how they had been bullied, manipulated, or silenced by Carol. There was a sense of liberation that filled the air as neighbors no longer feared retaliation for speaking up. The newfound unity was palpable, and for the first time in years, the community was genuinely starting to rebuild. My family was able to begin healing in a way that had felt impossible during the chaos. The funeral itself, which had been tainted by Carol's actions, no longer seemed overshadowed by the cloud of her manipulation. We had justice, not just for my daughter, but for the whole neighborhood. And Carol, well, her influence crumbled. The eviction notice served by law enforcement was a fitting end to a reign built on fear. She was forced to leave, and the community that she had tried to dominate was finally free to move on without her shadow looming over them. For me, though, the most important outcome was the realization that standing up for what's right, no matter how hard it is, changes everything. The emotional toll of the experience had been heavy, but the weight of the injustice was far heavier. Once the truth came to light, everything fell into place. It wasn't just about fighting for my family anymore. It became about fighting for a better, more just future for everyone who had been too afraid to speak up. The ripple effects of Carol's downfall were felt throughout the entire community. At first, it was just a small group of people who were motivated by the stories they heard. But as more people shared their experiences, the community began to understand that Carol wasn't just an isolated problem. She was part of a larger pattern of power abuse in homeowner associations, HOAs, everywhere. It wasn't just our neighborhood that had been affected. It was happening all over the country, in small towns, suburbs, and gated communities. People were starting to realize how much power some HOA presidents, like Carol, could wield. They could destroy lives, intimidate residents, and enforce draconian rules that made people feel like they were living in a dystopia. The biggest lesson to come from this was that power needs to be checked, and it's essential to never let anyone feel like they are untouchable. Carol's reign had lasted far too long because people didn't speak up. The system allowed her to thrive by silencing dissent and keeping people in line. But once people found the courage to stand together, the balance of power shifted. The lesson was clear. Never let the fear of retaliation stop you from doing the right thing. Communities need to be built on transparency, respect, and fairness, not on fear, manipulation, and intimidation. For everyone in the neighborhood, the aftermath was a call to action. It was a reminder that each person, no matter how small they felt, had the power to change their environment for the better. People who had been afraid to confront Carol, who had been silenced by her threats and bullying, were now standing up, speaking out, and joining in the effort to create a community of inclusion, respect, and fairness. The once dreaded HOA meetings were now full of residents who were ready to be heard, who demanded accountability and fairness from those in power. Carol's downfall didn't just change the dynamics of our small neighborhood. It sparked a larger conversation about corruption and power abuse in all institutions. If a single family could stand up to the tyranny of an HOA president, imagine what could happen when entire communities, towns, and cities decide to hold those in power accountable. If you're tired of feeling silenced, don't stand by. Speak up, take action, and demand accountability. Every voice matters in the fight for fairness and justice. Don't let anyone bully you into submission. Join the movement for real change today.